Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in the American Inspiration Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted that you're with us tonight in the land of literature, the history of our country and its people, good and bad. On your screen is a schedule for tonight's hour-long event featuring the celebrated novelist Christina Schwartz and her latest book, Bonnie, a novel about Bonnie Parker of the infamous crime duo Bonnie and Clyde. Many of you have attended our virtual events before. If so, forgive my reviewing yet again a few housekeeping items. We are in a webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we can't take your comments in the chat box, we will share some relevant links there, so do keep an eye out. We do want to hear from you, though, especially if you have a question for the author. You can place those right in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Many of you submitted questions as you registered. Our moderator, Sandra Loh, was so excited to see those. If you think of others, please enter them into the Q&A, and Christina and our guest moderator, as I said, Sandra Tsing Loh, will cover as many as they can get to. Tonight's event is being recorded by my colleagues here at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and the link will be published on our Education and American Inspiration website pages. So if you have friends who are off doing Christmassy things and they want to hear this, the link will be out and around. Check back for that. We'll also share the links in the chat. And please know, if you like what you see and hear tonight, signed copies of the book Bonnie can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. You'll see on your screen that if you use the code AMINSP as you order online, they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail. I am told this won't get you a book in time for Christmas, but alas, it'll be a good New Year's treat, or you could be in touch with the bookstore if you want to pick up the book, those of you who are local, or send it faster. I'm Margaret Talcott. I'm a director at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and the producer of the literary programs for our research center. Tonight's talk is meaningful not because it is inspirational, and I know that you all know this series is called American Inspiration. Indeed, there are few of us who aim to be criminals, but we are welcoming Christina Schwartz for the excellence of her writing, her storytelling, her approach to historical research, and developing a sense of place in her books. In fact, she'll be back with us in March for an educational program on this very topic of recreating place. But for tonight, we are all about Bonnie, the woman, who is very much part of American history. And while Bonnie was indeed bad, there is quite a story in her story. It's the story of our country during the Depression, of the American Southwest. It's a story of our national fascination with gangsters and shootouts. Bonnie is legendary. And as you'll see in this book, she is fascinating and very much a woman, for better or for worse. Before author Christina takes the screen, a few words about her background, and also about our guest moderator, Sandra Tsing Loh, who will be joining us in a little bit. Christina Schwartz is the author of 5 novels, including The Edge of the Earth and the Oprah Book Club selection, Drowning Ruth. Her celebrated works have been situated across the United States, in Wisconsin, New York, California. Bonnie is her first book set in Texas, and she has some great tales about traveling around Texas in her research. Christina tonight is actually joining us from Pasadena, California, so she does not have the specter of our snowstorm weighing on her. So is our moderator in Pasadena, Sandra Tsing Loh. A bit about Sandra. Sandra's memoir, The Mad Woman in the Volvo, was one of 2014's New York Times 100 notable books. Her follow-up book, just published, The Mad Woman and the Roomba, is, I said, just out, and it's to great acclaim. Her commentaries and her stories have been heard on NPR's Morning Edition and on This American Life. So we want to welcome them both, but first we want to welcome Christina. Christina, we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us. I can't believe you still have light out there. We're very jealous, and it's not even snow. So do you want to kick us off with sort of a brief history of how you came to write Bonnie. Tell us a little bit about the book. And
Sure, sure. Well, I am really looking forward to talking about Bonnie today. But I know that the American Inspiration series is mostly focused on history. So I wanted to say that I am particularly honored to be the first novel, or Bonnie is the first novel that you decided to include in this series. But I also, in thinking about that, wanted to point out that I think that Bonnie is appropriate because obviously she's a historical figure, but also that I think as an author, I'm an appropriate choice because this is the third of my novels that is based on historical research. My first novel, my most popular novel, Drowning Ruth, really came out of stories that my parents and my grandparents and my great aunts told me about our family and about the place where I grew up and where they had grown up. They've been in the same place for many years. And in fact, my father just keeps pressing these things on me. I thought you might be interested in seeing these journals from this one's from 1920. It's my grandparents' wedding trip. It says things like cigar and gin, 25 cents. And so that book, it was definitely has, even though it was completely fiction, definitely had historical basis. And the other book that I wrote that's very historical is The Edge of the Earth. And that was the first time that I deliberately did historical research for a novel. And that one is set in Big Sur, California, at the lighthouse there at the end of the 19th century. So that one took a lot of research, and I really learned how to do historical research for that book. So Bonnie, though, is the first book I've written that's based on a true character, a real person. And that turned out, I thought, was going to be somewhat easier because I thought the plot would be written for me. And that's true. But it turned out to have its own challenges, obviously. I learned a lot about how to research a real person working on this book. Our theme tonight is supposed to be women, crime, and Christmas. So even though those sound like complete non sequiturs, they fit very well together for this era. Probably you already know that the Depression was a special time, unusual and anomalous, that this is sometimes known as the public enemy era. And Bonnie was not the only woman who had a criminal career. I think Ma Barker is probably the most famous, but there were a few others during this time when police had fewer resources than criminals. The criminals had the machine guns, the criminals had the fast cars. Towns were really isolated, and the media thought that the stories about what the criminals were up to it was just, in a lot of ways, great entertainment for people who were struggling through the Depression. And I think Bonnie, even though there were a few other women criminals, Bonnie is definitely responsible for Clyde's success as fame. He would not in any way have been, he was really a two-bit, not successful criminal, and no one would know about Clyde Barrow if it weren't for his partner being a woman, and an interesting woman, a woman with some style. And she was aware of that, and I think he was aware of that. So that's sort of an interesting twist. It turns out that the novel is kind of structured around Christmas. Bonnie's father died the day after Christmas when she was 4. And as I see that, that was a pivotal event for her. There's an important scene on Christmas Eve, when they become part of a bigger gang. And finally, there's a very poignant Christmas scene when Bonnie realizes very clearly that her life is not and never will be what she hoped. And that's linked, sadly, to Christmas. So I think that's all I have to say in introduction, and I'm hoping that we can start conversing, Sandra.
Hello. That
Hi.
worked out. Oh, and I'm also Pasadena, but now in Sun. Excuse me. I'll be. And I think I've taken my American inspiration that I was having a really bad Zoom hair day, so I attached a beret like Faye Dunaway wore in the movie.
I didn't even thought of that. Perfect. Perfect.
My American inspiration. And I want to say before we jump in, when I was listening to you describe this book, which is so fantastic, and it is just, I kept reading it faster and faster because the cars go faster and faster and you're leaving the sitting on gunshots and you like, it's really, it's more entertaining than perhaps it should be because I was just ripping through it. But I think it's a perfect Christmas read in the pandemic. All Bonnie wanted is like to sleep in, have a shower, have a Coke and a sandwich, like, and not being on the run. And that's what we do in the pandemic, like all day long. So it actually is a great read, I will say, in this particular time. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk until about 40 past the hour. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And also we have some reader questions that came in beforehand and they're really fantastic. So I thought we would jump in with some of those, and I will, of course, ask as we go. And I think the first question has to do where the reader asks, how accurate was the movie? It's so totemic, and I assume that's the 1967 Arthur Penn movie with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway.
Well, I think the beret is accurate. Bonnie was very stylish. She was very interested in style, and she had a lot of hats. Everyone wore hats then, but she had a lot of interesting hats. Sometimes she took Clyde's tie and put that around her coat. She was very interested in clothes and style, and so that part was accurate. Otherwise, honestly, I haven't seen the movie since probably the 80s, and because I deliberately did not want to watch it when I was writing this. But from what I remember, and of course everybody talks about it to me after I've written this book, or even while I was writing the book, the book is entirely different. The Hollywood entertainment version and the real version, which is what I was trying for, are completely different things. Bonnie and Clyde's life was much harder, much more gritty, much less, certainly in some ways dramatic, but in some ways, one of the most difficult things about writing this novel is that so much of it was tedious. And you want to convey the idea that this was really boring and tedious without making the book boring and tedious, which was hard. Excuse me. So yeah, they lived out of their car a lot of the time. When they weren't living out of their car, they were living out of abandoned houses. They couldn't bathe very often. Sometimes they bathed like in a creek. They ate beans most of the time, or they ate hot dogs, I think, quite a bit. And their crimes were usually not successful. Clyde thought that he wanted to be a bank robber, but it turned out to be very risky to be a bank robber, and he botched a lot of the bank robberies. I mean, the book isn't at all funny, but the things that go wrong are edge on ridiculous, I guess. And several times they got their money by breaking into gumball machines. So that's how un-Hollywood their excursion was.
Right, and I think partly in reading it, I was weirdly reminded of, and I'm in Sun, of sort of Shackleton's like trips in the Arctic, because stuff really, glass goes into people's eyes. It's grisly, and sort of, and you know, Bonnie's leg is wounded, and there's doctors, but you can't go to the doctor. You have to drive far. I mean, it's really very visceral. It's not at all boring. It's not. It's really visceral. It's a survival tale.
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, the deterioration. I mean, it was, as I see it, it was this just steady deterioration. And yes, glass in people's eyes, holes in people's heads, bullets in stomachs. There was a lot of blood. They did keep surviving. Bonnie did have this terrible accident where her leg was pinned under the car and burned. And as she did recover, obviously, but the way it healed, the scar tissue kept her knee bent, so she really could never walk without a pronounced limp after that. And she always smoked and she always drank before any of this, but those habits just got worse and worse. And she chain smoked and she drank pretty much as often as she could. And everyone understood that she was trying to escape by doing this, but it wasn't good for her skin.
So, and that kind of brings, now that you're talking about how many hot dogs they ate, there is a previous reader question that's also sort of touched on in live. So we're going to go live of Helen O'Connor asks, what are your primary sources? And a reader had also asked, same question, what were the primary sources? How did you learn about the hot dog?
Well, I did start, there are a couple of key books about Bonnie, sort of historically researched books. And I did start with those and then looked at the footnotes and then followed through with the newspaper articles that those books cited. And what was sort of interesting about them is you cannot trust local newspapers to get the facts right. And a lot of times I ended up having to make a decision about what seemed most plausible to me. For instance, with that injury to Bonnie's leg, there were different, I guess those weren't even reported in the paper, but different people who have researched report this in different ways, that it happened in different ways, that it burned for different reasons. And I sort of had to sort out what really made sense and what was just a story. Also, some of she certainly was sensational. As a couple, they were sensational, and so the media really played on that. And I think so did witnesses. And there are reports, certainly towards the end, that there was a horrible shooting of 2 motorcycle police, and in some of the newspaper accounts, they have a witness saying that he saw a woman standing over the fallen policeman and shooting him and laughing and saying that his head was bouncing like a rubber ball. And clearly, when you look more closely at the accounts, you can put together that that's just impossible. There couldn't have been a witness that close there. It just doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make sense for Bonnie's character once you do more research. But those things really pepper the newspaper articles because they made good copy. So I would say, my primary resources were those newspaper articles, but taken with some skepticism.
Right, and which is another reader question who recently read a book which said Bonnie never actually killed anyone. Do you think?
I agree with that. I think she never liked guns. She didn't like guns as a child, and she never grew to like them. She did a lot of loading for Clyde, but she didn't like shooting guns. And I think there was one occasion where she did shoot a gun sort of wildly out the window, and she did end up hitting someone in the house who was like at her vanity brushing her hair, and but she didn't kill her. It's grazed her elbow or something like that. But I don't think that Bonnie herself ever killed anyone, and it's sort of, it's hard to know how much she thought that meant that she wasn't as involved in this as Clyde was, because she didn't actually pull the trigger. That's sort of an interesting question. But
No, and
I don't think she did.
It's really interestingly done in the book. And once you get deeper and deeper, it's kind of like, just keep driving faster to get away from what happened. So you sort of kind of logically you're weirdly on her side.
I mean, I think it seems to have felt to them like these things kept happening to them. And it wasn't
like suddenly, whoa, things spun out of control.
Yes. I mean, certainly, for instance, they kept, and this is one thing that makes it a good book, they kept waiting a little too long.
Yes,
like,
1 extra day.
Yes, let's just stay one more day. And then, that day turns out to be a disaster. And a lot of times it was because of a mistake. It wasn't because anyone was after Bonnie and Clyde specifically. But for instance, when they were in Joplin, Missouri, they were staying at this apartment. They stayed one more day, and someone had reported some suspicious noise at night, and there was a big problem with bootlegging because this is during Prohibition. And so some police were coming just to investigate reports of possible bootleggers. But of course, anytime the police are anywhere near Bonnie and Clyde, they started shooting, and that was
and the paper over the windows, it just didn't look very good to the outside. So I think a really interesting strand also that people should know, of course they will all be reading the book, so they will know, is that, so I'm kind of wrapping a couple of questions together, which is like, how does a star student go from that to loving a desperado? And I think something that's so interesting is her own writing. And Barbara Bourne has written in real time. Did you discover any written material by Bonnie, such as letters, diary, etc.? Very interesting question.
Yeah, I did. Yes, and that was, there's actually a book called Fugitives that was written very soon after Bonnie died. It was sort of an as told to, and it was Bonnie's mother and Bonnie's sister who talked to a reporter, and then the reporter wrote this book called Fugitives, which is was really helpful for getting sort of a flavor of the period. There's been a lot of controversy later about how factual that book is. So I couldn't really rely on it entirely for the facts, but it did have snippets of her diaries, which really gave you a sense of her voice, which was really helpful. And she was, in her diaries, somewhat disappointingly, I guess, for someone who's trying to write a novel about her, she wrote like a teenage girl writes a diary. Yeah, like, oh, I miss him. Oh, I'm never going to love again. So the actual words I couldn't use too heavily because it doesn't make for interesting reading, but it did give me a sense of her voice, and also just the idea that she was like a typical teenage girl. That intrigued me. And I guess that goes back to that first question. So how does someone, I mean, not let alone the straight A student, which is interesting, but how does some just typical teenage girl end up being Bonnie Parker of Bonnie and Clyde?
So, and I think and I think the listeners, I didn't mean to interrupt, would know I'm just trying to weave together a couple of things. So Sharon Snowden would like to know, where did she meet Clyde? She got married very early to Roy Thornton, and another reader wanted to know why she didn't divorce Roy. So if you could sketch in a little bit of that section. And
that brings us back to the straight A student part too, because so she was, and I think she was a straight A student because she was bright. She won a spelling, like a countywide spelling bee when she was in 8th grade. And I think that she wrote these poems, tells me that she was really interested in words, and she was clearly a very curious person. She wanted to be a poet, and she also wanted to be a movie star, and she wanted to be a singer. She wanted some sort of dramatic life, but I think lots of people want to be a movie star or a singer, but a poet seems kind of unusual. But really all of that changed, and again, kind of a typical teenage girl way. In high school, she decided that being in love was more interesting than doing her homework, and it was pretty and it was pretty typical of girls to get married even in high school in her socioeconomic class. So she and I do feel like that she probably felt like studying, it was not only not as interesting, but where was it going to get her, really? It didn't, and she was very dramatic, she was very romantic, and the idea of being in love, I think, was just such a much more exciting story for her. And so I think that's why she married Roy Thornton at 15. And that was one way in which, this sort of brings us to this woman theme, one way in which she could be active instead of passive. She could kind of take control of her life and say, oh, I'm in love with him, let's get married. And again, it wasn't that unusual for someone to get married, to drop out of school and get married at 15 at that time in her socioeconomic class. So she married Roy Thornton, and he turned out to be a criminal, and he cheated on her, and he did end up in jail. And she said later, when she was with Clyde, and she still wore her wedding ring from this marriage, she said to her mother that it just didn't feel fair or right to divorce someone when they were in jail. And I think that, to me, that says a lot about who Bonnie is. I think she would have divorced him if he were fooling around on her. But once he was in jail and there was nothing that he could do to help himself, she thought that would be mean. She was a very sort of generous person. And she thought that was kicking a guy when he was down. I guess that's the way to describe it. So that's why she said she didn't divorce him. And I think, given everything that I've read about her, it makes sense.
So, which is another way I'm sort of massaging a question that someone asked in terms of what you think is the one thing that pushed Bonnie to her dark side. It seems it's being in love with Clyde. Is that how would you answer that?
Well,
the dark side.
Maybe, but I would think it's maybe even more general than that. It's the idea of wanting to be in love, and that she chose Clyde as the object, and he fit that well. And then I think she really did love him, but she didn't want to fall out of love with him, because that would ruin this love story that she had decided was her life. That love was the most important thing. The most important thing was to be a good partner in this, a good girlfriend and a good partner to the person she loved. And I think my sense is she told herself this story. This is who I am. I am a loyal partner to the man I love. And then she didn't think about it again. She just stuck with that. And that, to her, in her mind, I think that redeemed her. That made all the things that she was doing not as bad as they would have been otherwise, because she was doing them because she was attached to Clyde, and that's what it meant to be attached to Clyde. And she just decided that was, in a way, I don't know, morally good is probably not the right way to describe it, but that was who she wanted to be. It's romantic, the good romantic love.
Yeah, and I want to add, because we're caught up in discussing Bonnie, of course, as we should, but this book you are a fantastic and noted fiction writer. And the way that you paint this world, it is so easy to track and follow. Even the first time that she brings the gun to him in jail, and she doesn't like handling guns. It's like, ew, and then under a pillow. And that she first thinks she shouldn't do it, but there's just this expression that crosses his face where there's an idea that she won't. Kind of a softening or a slackening, it, like you describe it so much better, where she remembers that look and thinks, if I don't, another girl will. I mean, it is painted, everything that you're saying about a teen girl, it really does track. And I think that's kind of the magic trick that you pull off in this book, because she is a teen. It totally makes sense. And what she gets upset
it doesn't
with,
happen suddenly. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I mean, she does one thing, then she does another thing, and then she does, and she just gets sucked in. And the farther in she is, the worse it would be if she says, oh, that was all wrong. If she says it's all wrong, then her whole story to herself about who she is and what makes her a valuable person is destroyed.
And it seems so right-sized for that age, of even the moments of generosity, like giving two girls dolls that were left on a bench, and the bountiful, like Lady Bountiful, but she's like coming in a nightgown, bloody, like here are some dolls. It really is sort of a coming of age while murdering and then dying. Yeah, I mean, it is so poignant, of jumping forward and babies and what she wanted. It's really an incredible portrait. It's an incredible character portrait. Okay, so back to our fantastic reader questions. And I think that this is, before we go actually to your process a little bit, which is, I think, really fantastic. When you wrote Bonnie, how did you avoid glamorizing a murderer?
Well, I was worried about that, and in some ways worried that even just writing about this subject does somewhat glamorize, because it puts a lot of attention on these people who are not good people. But I think once you really start reading about them and if you want to get at the truth of it, it was very easy not to glamorize, because it wasn't glamorous. So as long as I was telling the truth, I wasn't a danger to glamorize. And then my goal in writing the book was not to write the Hollywood version, but to write the real version. And it was just so unglamorous.
Right, and what you have in the book, as opposed to the Faye Dunaway, Warren Beatty version, which was not done in smell-o-vision. There's a lot of they smell rank, and that because they haven't showered, and then when they have one innocent couple, or they pick up, and she's talking about like recipes and stuff, and just this, when she described later what Bonnie smelled like, because they've just been it is very gritty.
Yes,
it's not. It doesn't seem like fun.
Right. It was it was easy not to glamorize when you looked at the real thing. And I guess as a novelist, what's interesting to me is looking at the real character. So even if you put the real facts aside, examining who the person is really, their psychology and their character, is what's interesting. And that's never glamorous. It's kind of the opposite of glamorous, no matter who you're writing about. So I think that too made it easy to avoid glamour.
Another question in the moment by Cindy Terrian, and apologize if I butcher mispronouncing your names. What was the most surprising thing you learned while writing this book?
Oh, what an interesting question.
Good one, Cindy.
Yes, you stumped me. Most surprising thing. Well, there's, I guess, certainly one of the most surprising things. There's a very famous picture of Bonnie smoking a cigar with one foot up on the car fender, and I knew that she was, very quickly, I knew she was this sort of dramatic person. And like everyone else, I think, thought that was a persona that she wanted to project. In fact, that incident when they took those pictures, it was Clyde, Bonnie, and their third member, this young man, WD. And Clyde had stolen a camera for WD because they'd had a big fight and he was trying to make up to him. And they stopped and took these pictures. It is this one really kind of pleasant moment of playfulness among them. And she's posing, and she's posing with a gun, pointing it at Clyde, but they're doing it for each other. And she's doing it playfully. She's doing it kind of to make fun, I think, of the character that she's become. She's not doing it because she's this tough cigar smoking gun moll. And those pictures were discovered in the apartment in Joplin, Missouri. And the press obviously loved them. And ever after that, she was at great pains to try to dispel this image. She wanted to be feminine, and the idea, I mean, even beyond shooting a gun, didn't care to be, if she was seen with, like, there was some nickname for her, two gun gal, I think. And at first she was like, oh, two gun, no, I don't like guns. So I'm like, two gun gal, yeah, I kind of like that, two gun gal. But the idea that she would be smoking a filthy cigar, she wanted no part of that. And once someone they kidnapped said, what do you want me to tell people after you let me, they were letting him go. He says, is there anything you want me to tell people? And she said, tell them I don't smoke cigars. And she really wanted her mother to know that she never smoked cigars. So I would say that is the most surprising, that was so important to her.
Of all the things.
Right, yes, all the things.
So I think, and you're the first novelist in this series, I think weaving together two questions of, and the first is kind of what I would love you to explain, of a little bit of your process of researching, not just going to the primary source materials, but the car journey that you took to
yes.
that you were going there. And also, perhaps weaving in, as you tell us, this reader question, as you learn more about Bonnie, what aspects of her personality or psyche did you most or least identify with? So this is
that's a good question too. Yes, well, the reason I am doing this seminar in March on recreating place is that place is, as a novelist, place is incredibly important to me. I once tried to write a novel set in Columbus, Ohio, and I got stuck even in the first chapter. It's like, I've been there, I don't know it. I have to really know a place. I think place has a lot of effect on character. And so I think it both forms people, and also it helps me to form people. It helps me to write them if I can see how or feel how they react to, like, the color of the sky where they are, or the feel of the air, or the kinds of trees. I don't know, I just think in those I think in a lot of ways I am sort of a visual movie-ish kind of writer, and I need those external things. So we did, I made my husband and son and two dogs and cat drive in our minivan to Texas, visited all the places that I knew Bonnie had something to do with. And she drove a lot. They kept circling and circling. They always circled back to Dallas, which is another interesting thing about both of them, how attached they were to their parents, really to their mothers. And that maybe we can weave in Christmas later with that. So they kept circling back to Dallas. but they went as far as Minnesota. There's a big shootout in Iowa. They went to New Mexico. They went to North Carolina. I didn't go there, but, or at least I didn't go there researching this, but there were many, many places that I wanted to visit and see what it felt like to be right there. And interestingly, in Texas, there are many places that haven't changed, or they've changed in ways that make you feel like you could still imagine easily what it was like. The town where Bonnie was born is sort of on the edge of Western and Central Texas, but more Western. And it's one of those small towns that's was on a railroad stop, and there isn't much there anymore. But that means that all those buildings that were there are just kind of stuck there. Nothing ever modernized. And there are a lot of towns around Dallas, the same thing, like the streets are still brick. And the downtown feels pretty much like what I think the downtown would have felt like when Bonnie and Clyde were there. So that was helpful for researching. And because they were in such rundown areas, that like the service station that Clyde's parents ran, it's still there. It's a derelict building, but that area of Texas is nothing's happened there. The grade school that she went to, and actually here we go back to this primary source, like what really happened. Someone found a report card in the basement with her name. So I think she went to at least 8th grade there, but I'm not sure. The dates don't. I'm not sure what quite adds up, but I think she spent at least 1 year at this grade school. And when I visited that, it was surrounded by a chain link fence also, and boarded up and derelict. It has recently been, the area has been gentrified. And so now it's been turned into some sort of, I don't know if it's an office building or something like that. I haven't been back there since then, but still, so that I saw just in time, I think, before it really changed. And then there are places, like there was a big shootout in a place outside of Kansas City. And that was really, I wanted to see it, but it was hard to imagine where it had happened because there are interstates and fast food places at that spot. So I don't know. I don't want to say too much about recreating sense of place because I'm saving that for the seminar, but definitely place. I explored it. I imbued it. I tried to spit it back out.
She sat in the back of the car writing poems, and you sat in the minivan.
Ooh, clever. Yes, she did.
You didn't mean to shoot any people.
No, I didn't mean to.
Women and Christmas.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you reminded me of the writing the poems, because yes, I was supposed to talk about ways in which, we identified, right? Yes, she is writing these poems in the back of the car, just like working and reworking these poems that she'd written originally in jail, and some new ones, and that she was so dedicated to this and felt like this was when Clyde's business was arranging to botch some bank robberies. Her business was to write these poems, and a lot of times she wrote their sort of ballads about Bonnie and Clyde. So she was romanticizing. She was kind of, I wouldn't say glamorizing, but she definitely was sort of romanticizing their exploits. And when they had a big fight, this is Clyde's pattern, he stole a typewriter for her to make up to her. And she was, at least in my version, she was very pleased to have the typewriter. And here's another way in which we overlap, because the difference between the way a handwritten thing looks when it's done, much as I like to write by hand, it suddenly feels like a real thing if it's typed. It seems like something print, just like the book that seemed, when it's on my computer, like, what is it? But then when it's like a book, it's the exact same words, but suddenly it's a real thing. So, and I think she must have felt, because she certainly used that typewriter a lot, and I think she must have felt like this is making the poems more solid and real. I would say also, I was a good student, I think, in those ways, the overlap. And the reason I thought that she would be a character I could write about is her interest in words that made me think that she was more self-aware than someone you would expect who had this career. And so that definitely is a big overlap. The idea that she kept circling back to her family, that this place in Dallas was really important to her. I keep circling back to Wisconsin. That place is really important to me. That's another overlap.
So, and I think finally, and you do have time to answer this, and this is another one, a combo question from the viewers. It's a kind of two-part. One, how do you find inspirations and subjects for your novels? And another reader says, I want to know how to turn everyday experiences, or exciting ones, into interesting stories. How do you do that?
Well, I think those are two really separate questions. The inspiration is a hard question because it feels like every book I've done has come from a very different place. And I do feel like there's some work involved to being inspired. I don't think you can just sort of sit around and wait for it to hit you. You kind of have to look under rocks and see if you can find it. But I can't say exactly where it's, there is no pattern to where it's come from, but I'm always looking for it. So I would say that's the answer to that question as best I can do. And the turning everyday things into stories, I think the best way I can describe that is I did take a painting class when I was in college. I'm a horrible artist, but I think what I do somewhat naturally as a writer was articulated by the painting teacher, because he said, you have to learn to really look. Like, you can't look at something and see it the way you expect to see it. You have to look at it like it's never been seen or described before. And I can describe that better with drawing, because it was like this epiphany when the teacher said, no, you have to really look. It was the difference between, oh, that's a table, and seeing that, oh, actually it's a line that goes like this, and a line that goes like this, and a shadow that goes like that. And I think, to me, that's what happens when you turn an everyday story into something interesting, is that you're not seeing a table anymore. You're seeing a line, a shadow, and how they come together. And so that way you're really seeing. That's really abstract, but that's the best way I can describe it.
And one more question back to Bonnie and Clyde, if you don't mind, because it's so fascinating, from Linda Cole. Well, let's say, it's another one of the famous two-parters, but this will be the last. Linda Cole wonders, what did Bonnie and Clyde do with their money? And the answer is kind of amusing. It seemed amusing. And Eileen O'Halloran is wondering if you have any thoughts as to why Bonnie seemed so beloved.
Yeah, that's a good question too. All good questions. Very good questions.
They are very good.
What they did with their money? Well, sometimes they did have money, and they did various things. They gave money. They definitely gave money to their families. They gave money to their mothers regularly. Clyde often gave money to, or gifts, a lot of gifts to his younger sister. once or twice, they actually went back and gave money to people that they had stolen from. And I think, they liked, again, the story about themselves. They liked the idea that they were kind of Robin Hoodish.
Right.
So they said, we're stealing the stuff because we need it, but, we'll pay it back. And at least once they actually did, maybe twice. So not too much, but they often had no money. I mean, often they again, as I said, they were breaking into gumball machines and using pennies to buy hot dogs. So they often did not have money to spend. I guess the other big thing that Clyde spent money on, he had spent money on, I was going to say he spent money on weapons. He did. Also, a lot of the weapons he got were from breaking into National Guard armories. But sometimes he bought weapons. He had this big, his overriding plan was to break into the prison that really, I think, changed his life hugely. And he wanted to cause a prison break. So he was constantly planning and amassing weapons for that. So he did spend money on that too.
So, and we're going to bring Margaret back just in about 1 minute. So do you have 1 minute on why you think Bonnie is so beloved before Margaret comes back? And she should be readying her camera.
I think people have mixed feelings. I mean, I think a lot of people hate Bonnie for sure. But I do think that she is someone that people kind of, she had this story. She was unusual in this time. And I think people in the Depression, they wanted someone to get something that people were suffering so much. They wanted to see someone achieving something, and this was exciting, and an exciting story. And yeah, she was a woman, I think, helped with that. And that's not a very articulate answer, but
it's a great answer. And on that note, let's bring back Margaret, who will unmute herself. So
I am unmuted, and I have Christmas lights on because we're headed into quite an exciting season here with a snowstorm and Christmas. But that was so fascinating. And, you talk about looking under rocks for inspiration. And, we have, so many of us have, botched Christmases here, and we're going to be looking under snowbanks tomorrow. And I just wanted to ask you, Christina, if you could tell us just walk us through the 2 or 3 Christmases very quickly, and then take us into a last reading, if you could.
I'm going to leave and take myself off camera so we can enjoy.
And we're going to thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, as I said, they very early, her father died right after Christmas. So that, I think Christmas often was this big contrast for her between the hopes, the dreams that she had, what she wanted for her life. The idea of Christmas really represents that. And that she just wasn't getting it ever because of the choices she made. Christmas is a really good device to make that stand out. So it's very appropriate for this year's Christmas. The part I want to read was actually the one successful Christmas. They had just started up with WD, this young man who kind of made a family for Bonnie, and she felt like she wasn't going to be able to go home. She was going to miss out on having this family Christmas, and she was comforted by the idea that now the 3 of them kind of could be a family. And so they're in this motel room, and she's actually prepared gifts for the 2 men, Clyde and WD, their poems that she wrote. So I'm going to read the little passage where Clyde asks for his gift. And this poem that I'm going to read is by Bonnie Parker. It's the one, I have a lot of poetry in this, but all of it except for this one I made up myself because in what I thought was her style, because it fit the places where I wanted to use poetry. But this one is really by Bonnie Parker. Christmas gift, Clyde demanded, pouncing on her the next morning. She'd revised a poem for him that she'd composed in the Kaufman jail. I'll cling to you and love you, and you'll never be alone. Just like the stars in heaven fling round the moon at night, I'll stay with you forever, whether you are wrong or right. Just like the perfume lingers on a rose until it dies, I'll stay with you and guide you with the love light in my eyes. She'd rolled the page into a scroll and tied it with a ribbon like she had Elsie's baby Ruth bar. She didn't expect Clyde to notice the rhyme of cling and fling, since the words weren't at the ends of lines, nor would he see the way she'd linked love to stars with the word light. But she knew he'd appreciate the theme of loyalty, the quality he most valued.
Haunting,
Thank
very
you.
haunting. And she was dead within 3 years. How many?
Yes, the whole thing was was really 2 years when they were running. Their relationship was a bit longer than that because he was in prison for quite a bit of time after they first met. But
so amazing. Christina, we are so grateful for your time with us tonight, and it's the holiday season, and I want to be respectful of people's dinner hours, and but we so enjoyed that, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming you back. Sandra, thank you so much. You LA Pasadena ladies, we are envious of your life and your world out there, and think of us back here on the East Coast. And thank you so much for joining us. We are so grateful at American Ancestors NEHGS to be able to present these American stories and such amazing true stories. And please know, if you have a story that you're trying to research or a keen interest in family history, either yours or others, please know that our research library is just the place for you. Here at American Ancestors, our doors, our virtual doors are wide open. You can visit our digital archives. You can connect with our genealogists on the phone or over Twitter, as well as through our website. And there you'll find free educational resources and author events to come, author events past. We have numerous past videos of wonderful author events just like this one. So if you get snowed in, those of you on the East Coast, do log in. Our mission remains to educate, inspire, and connect. Driven by our love of history and American stories, we're presenting more virtual talks next year. On Wednesday, January 13th, we're partnering with the State Library of Massachusetts to host the celebrated historian Eric J. Dolan with his new work, A Furious Sky, the 500-year history of hurricanes. The book looks at storms that botched the plans of Spanish explorers in 1559. And as well, it takes us right up to the many hurricanes that have impacted our lives and the lives of our family. On January 19th, we're partnering with GBH Forum Network to present Nadia Owusu with her deeply felt memoir about immigration and identity. Aftershocks, her book, is about how she found a life in this country as a newcomer. An 18-year-old girl landed in New York City, born of Armenian American mother and a father from Ghana who was a UN official. And on February 4th, the Boston Public Library joins us to present The Doctors of Blackwell, how two pioneering sisters brought medicine to women and women to medicine. Author Janice Nomura will be in conversation with Perry Klass, a doctor, an author, and a New York Times columnist. And as I mentioned at the top of our hour, on March 16, Christina will be back with us for a live event, an educational conversation course called Recreating Place, How Our Ancestors Lived. She'll be joined by museum curator and former director, Elliot Bostwick Davis, and Kyle Hurst, one of our star genealogists at NEHGS. They'll discuss the resources they use to research and present historical times and places. There is a lot to learn there. We hope you'll join us in 2021 virtually in that new year, which we hope will be a better year than this year. For now, we thank our featured authors tonight, Sandra, and also you, Christina. Thank you so much. And to all of you out there, thank you for joining us. We wish you a safe and inspirational evening and a very, very jolly set of holidays ahead. Deck the halls, and everyone, please take care. Bye now.